Exercising, you have a 2-hour window approximately where your enzymes for breaking down carbs can jump by up to 500%. So if you're going to eat your highest carb meal, do it the meal directly after you exercise. That will be the time you have the most enzymatic support to break down carbs.
Dr. Sam Shay solves health puzzles for busy, health-conscious entrepreneurs, biohackers, and longevity enthusiasts so that they can have a long and meaningful life. His journey has led him to specialize in functional lab and genetics analysis and his virtual coaching practice. Also, Dr. Shay is a stand-up comedian.
Food is not all good and all bad. Food is a tool. We just have to understand it. Like for some people, the tools are better than others. One trick I'd recommend for people is...
Hi, my name is Chris Burris. I'm a longevity expert and the chief scientist at a lab focused on a longevity molecule. My primary focus is to help people live longer and better lives with science. Make sure to subscribe and share so you and your friends can live longer and better. Well, actually, so you and your friends can live beyond the norms.
Hi, and welcome to the Live Beyond the Norms Health and Longevity podcast. I have an exciting episode for you today. This episode's kind of about me. Like I'm kind of the special guest on this one, guided by Dr. Sam Shay. Just a little bit about Dr. Sam Shay. He has been on the podcast before. He was on my longevity summit, so uncovering the secrets of longevity. Great content. I've actually introduced him to some podcasters because his content is so good. I've gone in and done his genetic test, and we're actually going to go over that genetic test, my results today, a little bit more about Dr. Sam Shay. He solves health puzzles for busy, health-conscious entrepreneurs, biohackers, and longevity enthusiasts so that they can have a long and meaningful life. I love that. This sounds like you're helping people live beyond the norms. His journey has led him to specialize in functional lab and genetics analysis and his virtual coaching practice. Also, Dr. Shay is a stand-up comedian. I've seen some of his stuff. It's great. I've actually shared some of his stuff with my own son, who had some of the challenges that Dr. Shay had when he was younger. So I'm excited to jump into this. If you could just give the briefest, because people can go back and listen to the previous episode, understand more in depth about you, and some of what we're going to cover today. But if you could just go briefly, how did you get here? And then we can kind of dive into these results.
Sure. I got into natural health the normal way, through tragedy. The same way I got into comedy, the normal way, through tragedy. And so I was very sickly as a child, starting at age 6. I've always been unwell since I was age 6. It started with my parents' nuclear divorce, in which me and my sisters were caught in the blast radius. And my parents did all the wrong things, and it led to mass amounts of stress and strife in the family. And all of us kids dealt it in different ways. I developed crippling insomnia, sugar and video game addiction, anxiety, depression, and I was the runt of my class in part because I was so exhausted from the sleep deprivation, but also I didn't have a growth spurt because my sleep insomnia lasted from 6 to 18, and it just kind of fed on itself. And so school there was a lot of violence, and at home there was a lot of gaslighting, so it just created a real downward spiral, and a very, very bad diet like SpaghettiOs and pasta, and I can't believe it's not butter, and high gluten foods, which is, if anyone here is listening to me talk about my genetics in particular, they'll say like that's the exact opposite of what I should have been eating. So it always just became a downward spiral until I made a decision in high school that I have to pivot to natural medicine. I was going to be the third generation medical doctor in my family, but instead I pivoted to natural medicine and went to college to get a pre-med and a holistic health practitioner certification. Then I went to chiropractic school and specialized in functional neurology and in nutrition. And then later on in practice, also got an acupuncture degree, and then switched to full-time functional medicine, and then now functional genetics. And this, it's been a very long, circuitous career. I don't call myself a health nut. I call myself a health mutt, because I'm a combo of so many different natural health professions. And I love genetics in particular because one, it personally solved a huge number of mysteries in my health. Like, what was my optimal diet? Why was I still in so much physical joint pain in my 30s, like an 80-year-old man? And for me, I realized that genetically, I am a paleo bordering keto diet when I was having a Portlandia Mediterranean style diet, even though it was all organic and local, like I knew the names of my farmers and their chickens, it still wasn't, there was the wrong carb ratios relative to my genes. I also figured out I was a hyper-inflamer, meaning that my inflammation, I had such a high hair trigger inflammatory response, and it was showing up for me anyway as chronic joint pain. And it was only from learning that in the genetics and the specific recommendations in the genetics where I was able to actually tamp down on the hyper-inflammatory genetic response. And like 1 little gram of fish oil that I was taking for years and years wasn't cutting it. I had to do additional strategies beyond just, what the bottle said. So there's a layer of depth that comes from genetic testing that you cannot get from functional testing. By functional testing, I'm talking about like mitochondria, gut, hormone, bloods, mold, Lyme, toxin. Those are all great. I do those also. Those are wonderful, but the genetics is a very different window into one's personal health and optimization. And to summarize the differences would be the following. Functional testing is the thumbprint of what's going on now. What are the infections now? What's your amino acid levels now? What's your mitochondria doing? What's your gut doing now? What's your hormones now? The genetics testing is saying, what is your way to live optimally through life? And then also, what are the weaknesses? What are the fault lines that you've inherited that you need to shore up, or they're going to show up? So the genetics and functional do a wonderful job working in synergy, but the genetics in isolation is incredibly valuable, as we'll go over your report right here today. The window into one's health and performance, it's a different window with genetics, and I would say that genetics is also the single most valuable test one would ever do for oneself, simply because you do it once and you're done. So you amortize whatever you invest in genetics over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, compared to a functional test, which you have to redo every 6 to 12 months or so. And there's not even a close second to genetics. So that's why I'm focusing on genetics, is because it is so valuable, especially over the long term. And the results they're so inarguable. Like, they're your genes. The end. And I found that for people who struggle with wanting to dip their toe into a natural medicine testing space, genetics is by far the easiest step into that, because genetics is such a hard-nosed science that it's easy for skeptics to wrap their head around by just, I'm going to get my genetics tested and look at what the data says about how I can live optimally. So I love genetics, and it's helped me personally, and it's helping. I think it's the most helpful tool for everyone to have going forward for the however many decades they plan on living.
Interesting story, right? Like, you grew up in this environment of chaos, and you had medicine in your family kind of gene pool already, and then ended up solving all the problems that the chaos created with that same thing that caused the chaos, which is the family, right? The kind of family tradition. I think that's an interesting.
The irony is not lost on me, Chris. That's correct.
And I distinctly remember, which is why I purchased your genetic test. Like, when it comes to ROI, genetic test is the biggest. And one of the things you said in the beginning, and I don't know if there's going to be a natural way to talk about this, but you made an example, and I'm paraphrasing and or butchering, but like, your genes, you may be wired for high carb, right? But your current gut biome may not be suited for high carb. And so you get this interplay of like, hey, this is the reality, but you might have to fix some stuff before you can get to where the reality is.
You're referring to the metaphor of you're having metabolic barbed wire wrapping one's genetics. And what you're referring to is there's a section of the audience listening now that I can guarantee has said the following thing. or some version of it. I've tried every diet and none of them work. I've tried the high carb, the low carb, you know, the vegan, the carnivore, the breatharian, whatever the thing is of the day. And the results are temporary or non-existent, or they go backwards, and there's just no rhyme or reason or logic of why no diet works, even completely polar opposite ones. And I was like that too. So here's what happens. And because this has been a riddle that's been bothering me for decades, and it wasn't until I figured this out with genetics that it all made sense. So if someone is genetically very low carb, like me, I have the second lowest, and we're going to cover carb tolerance in this in a bit more detail. If I have the second lowest carb tolerance, so you can have a carb tolerance from 1 to 20, I'm a 2, which is the second lowest one you can have.
Yeah.
So now if I have a low carb tolerance, I have a much higher like fat diet genetically because it's better suited to me. That's fine, except if I metabolically have a problem with my gallbladder or my pancreatic lipases or my carnitine shuttle, bringing fat to the mitochondria to burn, or have a problem with the mitochondria itself where it can't burn fat. Somewhere along that pathway of digestion, absorption, or utilization of fat, there's a problem. I may want fat genetically, but I can't use it metabolically. So if I try to eat fat, I'm going to feel bad metabolically. And if I don't eat fat, I'm going to feel bad genetically. So I'm going to feel bad no matter what. So in this case, I'd have to do one separate set of protocols and investigations, like functional testing, to figure out what's going on metabolically, functionally with gallbladder, carnitine shuttle, pancreas, mitochondria, etc. That's where functional testing is great, and where you figure out all those things. I work on those protocols, defang the barbed wire that's wrapping the genetics, and then I switch back to my correct genetics diet and protocols. So that's on the fat side of the spectrum for diet. But on the higher carb side of the spectrum, if I genetically have a higher carb diet that's best suited for me, but I have like a candida infection or some other overgrowth that just feasts on carbs, if I eat carbs, those infections are going to bloom, even though genetically I'm better suited for high carbs. So if I don't want the infections to bloom, I have a lower carb diet, but then I feel bad from a genetic point of view. So you're still having your genes wrapped in metabolic barbed wire. It's just a different type of barbed wire that's wrapping a different type of genetics. So there's a separate protocol to defang the barbed wire of all the infections, and a separate diet and a separate thing first. Then you can go back to your optimal genetics. And now the question is, well, what do I do first, the functional or the genetics? And my answer would be, if you're going to start somewhere, start with the genetics. And if you're hitting a plateau or not getting the results you're wanting with the genetics after like 2-4 months, then go investigate the functional, because the genetics is always going to be there. It's always going to be valuable. It's just not be available right now. It's valuable and it's present, but it's not fully available because you got to go figure out the metabolic barbed wire. So once you get the metabolic barbed wire dealt with, then you can come back to the genetics. It doesn't mean like all of the genetics is not useful. It's just the particular portion of the fence that is your genetic fence that is wrapped in barbed wire, that portion needs to be dealt with specifically. So I would say I would recommend they start with the genetics first if they had to choose. Some people just do both at the same time, and that's great, but not everyone can do that. So I'd say prioritize the genetics first.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's, probably can give a little bit of feelings of relief if you've gotten your genetic test, you're following it to the T and things aren't working well. Okay, then it's not that the genetic test is wrong. It's like something else metabolically wrong.
There's something interfering. You know, and this is chiropractic philosophy also. Like the body needs no intervention, it needs no interference. You remove the blockages and the body can repair itself. And the body's ability to recalibrate and repair is amazing as long as there's not things getting in the way.
Yeah, especially metabolically. All right, so I purchase your test, send off my samples, and I think you're making some adjustments to how you're doing the testing. I don't know if you want to talk about that, or we can skip right on to some of the results. I actually got this litany of results.
Sure. Well, the changes you're seeing, they're not changes, they're additions. So what happened mid-flight is that the genetics company released 2 additional reports, one on optimal exercise and one on fertility. And so right now, at the time of this recording, those reports are included when people get the official reports are included when people get the genetics, but my specific summary analysis has not yet been included in the my genetic summary reports for accounting for everyone's genetics. And people who have gotten these, they'll get the updates when I completely sift through all of the new fertility and exercise. In fact, I'm scheduled in, I think, 2 weeks right now to have a podcast with the PhD geneticist with all my Picayune questions to make sure that I completely got all of this correct, and then those answers will be incorporated into an update. So that's what happened. The exercise and fertility got added.
All right, so I got my results. They're in a platform, easy to get into platform when you follow the rules. I didn't. I think your team had to reach out to me a couple of times, and finally I followed their instructions.
Just a couple.
But I mean, the list is pretty extensive, right? So kind of the upfront list, so not in a zip file, supplement addendum, a lifestyle addendum, a genetic plus report, which I think we'll be spending quite a bit of time. There's also active choice kit, a carb choice kit, a fertility kit, food choice intolerance and sensitivity, diet choice, health and wellness kit, immune kit, supplement file. There's a lot of stuff here. I'm really excited. I know we're not going to touch all of that stuff. I'm not even sure. We're going to try and keep this to an hour and then under an hour, and then maybe we might have to do another one. But I'm excited to jump in here and kind of experience this process and learn more about my genetic profile. So at this point, I'm really going to let you take it away. You want to do a screen share?
Absolutely.
And I'll chime in whenever I get confused.
and also just to reassure our listeners as well, like if people decide to do this genetics report, what people get is not just the reports and the PDFs. I've also gone ahead and created an entire online resource portal, a resource library. There's easily 200 videos on there that not people have to watch, but are available that go through the individual genes or clusters of genes, so that if people want to linger and get and understand things more and more and deeper, that entire resource library is there, and it's kept being built out. And I run a thing called office hours as well for clients that want to have an office hours experience where I am teaching material and then answering questions at office hours, and then the material from that is then loaded into the online portal. So more and more things are being added, because I understand genetics is a long game. It's a long game. There's a lot of short-term benefits that can be done right away, and that's the whole point of this summary report that I'm about to walk through, is what are the quick, easy, actionable wins right now, and just know that genes are for life, pun intended. And that's why the resource portal has been created. So people don't need to understand it on the first pass, or all of it on the first pass.
And you also have, there's a process where you can pay just a little bit more money and then get like a consultation like this. I think that's a part of your process.
That is at this time, yes, but as things get bigger and bigger, that's not going to be fully available for everyone, because as this whole project gets bigger and bigger, we'll work in some more like coaching and things like that. That's in the works.
Yep, excellent.
So here we have the genetics report. This is just there's some slides here that are just explaining like, hey, congratulations, here's the test. Very important to have disclaimers in there to understand that genetics is a continuously developing and evolving subject, and that it doesn't replace the healthcare provider direct one-to-one consultant. All right, then we've got the major tests that we're covering. So you've listed off the names of the official reports. I renamed them here so they make much more sense. So rewiring your eating behaviors, understanding your immunity, vitamin D, your trigger foods, ideal diet, and natural weight. Now, natural weight is actually a bookmark for longevity, brain health, inflammation, and like there's so many things that go into weight, but how do you encapsulate into 4 words? They call it the health and well-being panel. I call it the achieve your natural weight. So then there's a section in here for people that don't know what a gene is. A gene is how it's how information is transmitted over time. And we have what's called sexual reproduction, where we have combinations of genes that recombine over generations down through a lineage. Because the problem of everyone being a clone is that the moment some opportunistic infection or virus gets a hold of one, the entire species is wiped out. Because everyone's the same, therefore they have the same vulnerability. So sexual reproduction, meaning the recombination of genes over time into a lineage, is a defense against predation, specifically predation by microorganisms.
Or a defense against extinction due to predation, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's implied. Yes, that is correct. And then there's an analogy for people again who are not as familiar with genes as you and I are. The best way to understand is that it's a library analogy, is that in each cell is a city, and a city has a library. That library is called the nucleus. The nucleus, the library has shelves. Those shelves are called chromosomes. On the shelves are called books, and those books are the bands of DNA that have the genes, the recipes. And then when you open a book and lay it flat, you have a recipe, one version of the recipe from mom on one page, one version of the recipe from dad on the other page. So when you hold the book flat, you've got the same recipe, but you could have either the same version or different versions, and that matters because if you have if you both mom and dad gave you the good version of the recipe, you get what's called a green dot or a normal wild type. If you have two bad versions, you get the quote red dot, which was called a homozygous variant, or it's a variant away from the normal or wild type. So the two bad copies equals red. If you got one good copy, one bad copy, you basically make a hybrid of the two recipes. So you get this yellow dot. Like it's not, and for people to understand, well, green, yellow, red dot, that means yellow's like in the middle, right? Almost no. Like the way we've got to consider, there are different genes have different degrees of severity. Like is a yellow dot just slightly less worse than a green, or just slightly less worse than a red? And for the vast majority of the genes we're discussing, that the yellow dot is actually near equivalent, but not equivalent to a red. That means that we treat yellows like reds, that we take them seriously. So that's where the term green, yellow, red dot comes from. So again, green dot means two good copies of the recipe. Red dot is two bad copies. Yellow dot is one good, one bad. And like with food, if like the recipe is like half wrong, the whole dish is going to taste weird. That's how you can relate it to, it's closer to a red dot. So now we're coming to the first custom slide here that is specific to you. So this, now for visually, for people just listening, what we're looking at here are four intersecting circles. That diet is really a Venn diagram where it's not one thing. It's actually the intersection of multiple things. So for example, we've got the inflammatory nature of one's diet and what to do to help decrease inflammation globally with according to Chris's genes. So one is high veggie intake, more omega-3. Some of this stuff I'm going to say is going to sound very obvious to some people, but it sounds obvious only because the research has been going on for 30, 40, 50 years. It wasn't obvious, before all this research. But there's some stuff in the genetics that will seem very, very like, well, I didn't need a gene test for that. And it's like, well, yes, and that's you taking the time to listen to health podcasts. There's a self-selection going on that it's great. Like people listening to podcasts like this or summits that Chris puts on or anyone else that puts on, you're really proactive in how you learn about holistic health and proper living in terms of wellness. So, but that's not everybody. So this may be news to a lot of people. maybe not you, the listener, but just bear with me. We'll get to the more nuanced stuff a bit later. So in Chris's case, it's like high veggie intake, more omega-3 foods, less omega-6 foods, cruciferous vegetables, colorful vegetables, avoid Western diet, and avoid veganism. That's in the genetics.
So, so this is interesting, right? So you have high veggie intake and high cruciferous vegetables, colorful vegetables, but specifically avoid veganism, right? So,
correct.
Got to have the meat. And I can tell you, I recently significantly increased my protein and really just meat consumption, and it's had an observable effect on muscle mass and,
right.
and my diet feels really good. And I'm stuffing protein in my face, so I'm doing intermittent fasting, so I'm hungry for a couple hours each day, but most of the time I'm sticking more food in my mouth than I don't know, seems almost natural, and I'm maintaining, really building muscle mass and maintaining overall weight.
Right, and I don't want to careen too far into the vegan landscape here, but I'm talking strictly from a genetic standpoint, and I'm sure there's people here screaming into their iPhones right now, saying, "Well, you haven't seen the research." And it's like, well, here's the thing. Every single epistemology I've ever had discussions with on vegans, like, well, I help myself with this. Like, yes, and I can point to that same anecdote with carnivore diet people. And it's like, well, you should see the science. Well, I can point to this science over here. And the answer is that I do not evolutionarily. We are this, and I look at the genes and the carb tolerance and how this all is working. I very rarely see someone truly thrive long term on veganism, and there's like a 2 to 5 year honeymoon with people where they have like their toxic bar, their vegetable nutrient bar, and their animal nutrient bar. If they're on a true vegan diet that's organic and local, not a Taco Bellitarian, their toxin bar can drop, their vegetable nutrient bar can go up, but it takes 2 to 5 years for their animal nutrient bar to drop down. So this 2 to 5 year honeymoon period, and by that time, a lot of vegans can change their social circles, start selling cashews and coconut oil, and alienate their friends and family, and it becomes so much cost. And this has happened. You know, this, I'm not saying this glibly. Like this, I've seen this happen in real time. And there's a sunk cost socially, economically, politically, environmentally, in their personal identity, that it becomes very hard to turn them around. In fact, Morgan Spurlock just died out of cancer. He's the guy who did Super Size Me. Remember him? He just died of cancer, and his girlfriend at the time during the movie, I've met her. She was a very famous vegan, and then she publicly had to go non-vegan about 10 years in because her health was falling apart. And so there's an entire unvegan movement as well that everyone needs to listen to. So we'll just pause that discussion.
And even carnivore, right? I think Saladino has stepped off of complete carnivore and is, so yeah, I think when you're at those extremes, we've evolved to be omnivores.
Omnivores, correct. Yeah. And there are shades of gray of omnivorism, which we're going to literally cover. That's the nuance that we're going to get into, is that there's shades of gray of omnivorism. And it comes down to carb tolerance in terms of ratios. So we've got the next circle to look at is the food triggers. So there's gluten tolerance, lactose tolerance, alcohol tolerance, caffeine tolerance, salt tolerance, histamine tolerance, and food allergy tolerance. So in your case, you're a yellow dot for gluten, which means that you have a genetic vulnerability for celiac disease, which means that gluten is not an option for you, period. And for people that are green dots, it doesn't mean gluten is good. It means that you don't have the genetic risk to develop celiac, but there is such a thing as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Usually it has to do with all the sprays that are dumped on gluten-based crops, and the body will attack the gluten, but it's simply because it's being the Trojan horse for toxic environmental pesticides and whatnot. The green and lactose means the genetic capacity to break down lactose sugar, which means that you have an easier time digesting lactose-based dairy products, but it's not a blank check to take on dairy. What it means is that the lactose portion, usually there's 3 major allergenic issues. Technically lactose is not an allergen, it's an intolerance. So you've got an intolerance to lactose sugar, but then there may be allergenic responses to the whey protein or the casein protein. So people who have a green dot in lactose, great. That's one of the three major variables is addressed, but there may be concerns around the casein or the whey or any other casomorphogens or other proteins that are floating around in the dairy, not the least of which, depending on the type and quality of the dairy, like is it full fat and pasture fed, or is it like some junk, lactate, convenience store stuff. Then alcohol is a yellow dot, meaning that your capacity to break down alcohol is limited. And yellow dots and red dots are they can develop things called like a flushing after alcohol or just feeling ill. Now, ironically, the people who are more prone to alcoholism are the green dots because they can pound way more alcohol before feeling unwell. And so alcohol is definitely a food trigger. The caffeine one, this is the one where I should probably include like a couple sessions of therapy for people, particularly entrepreneurs. So the caffeine one.
Wait, hold on before you get started on that.
Yeah, just take your last sips and enjoy, because you won't have any more after this. Right? So
I used to drink a lot more. I really, since, not ironically, but since starting taking my product on a regular basis, I have 1 cup, and it's really mostly about the like pomp and circumstance of like, I made a cup of coffee and it smells great and it's got cinnamon in it and some cocoa powder and, but yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so my sense is that the caffeine one. So what you're talking about is the ritual of coffee. It's just like the ritual of smoking. That a lot of people love smoking, not simply because there's a hit of nicotine, but it's actually like they step outside, they take a break. They're like the ritual of it. The entire process is itself soothing. It's the same thing with making coffee. Like I see people, even members of my own family, where the making of the coffee is actually more enjoyable than the drinking of the coffee. And I'm not taking, there's ways to substitute things in here, so you can still have the ritualistic enjoyment of the thing. But in terms of just the mechanics of how your genes intersect with caffeine, well, here we go. So there's a minimum 10% of the population, of which I'm a red dot, so I'm speaking from deep compassion here, where you can get, quote, caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. Caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. So that means that caffeine, that the energy one is feeling may not be energy, but maybe anxiety that is conflated as energy. That's what happened to me. I don't care how bulletproof your coffee may be, how much coconut oil or cinnamon or clove or whatever cinnamon, whatever things you dunk in that coffee, the caffeine itself is problematic. So yellow and red dots, and I'm a red dot, you're a yellow, have real problems with metabolizing caffeine in a way that's going to cause anxiety or depression. So when I lecture to rooms of entrepreneurs, when I mention the caffeine-induced anxiety or depression, you can literally hear the collective sphincter of the crowd clench out of sheer panic. Like, my company runs on caffeine. Like, how, and so it's you see and the funny part is like the negotiation starts the moment I set off stage. I have this line of slightly panicky people come up to, well, what about this caffeine? What about that? Like they just want to negotiate. So there are strategies which we won't go into here. There are strategies I talk about in the course and later on in the report that, like, how can you navigate supporting your energy systems without backfiring on your emotional systems if caffeine is not really an option for you. It's not for me. So I've gotten off of caffeine completely, and it's helped a lot. I miss it, but it's not a good idea.
Do you ever play around with decaf as part of the pomp and circumstance?
Okay, so yes, and that's a great question. So decaf, you can get like organic freeze-dried through the Swiss water method coffee crystals, which are very convincingly taste like coffee. There are also there's an entire ecosystem of like herbal teas that have no caffeine that have, I would generously say, approximate 80% of the flavor of coffee. And I'm being generous when I say generous. Generous. So, and the problem with coffee is not just the caffeine, it's also the histamine. because coffee also has histamine. So there's other concerns around coffee. Now, this is where I'll also have people screaming into their iPhones saying, hold on, coffee has all these wonderful nutrients and all the longevity studies and all these, and those are real. And this is why the image here is of intersecting Venn diagrams, because certain foods are healthy in certain ways and unhealthy in other ways. So, for example, alcohol was relatively healthy before modern plumbing, because drinking alcohol was the only guaranteed way to drink water that wasn't loaded with hidden waterborne infections.
Bacteria,
because the alcohol gluten. Okay, so without grains, there would be no civilization. Period. That is utterly inarguable. Without excess calories from these regions of the world, like Egypt, for example, where you suddenly have excess calories, suddenly you can have specialization. And like there's a great book by Peter Zeiban called "The End of the World is Just the Beginning." He goes through the entire history of commodities and resource management and geography and geopolitics, and it is it's like 16 hours of just of like a master's degree in human history, basically, and how it affects us now. So food is not all good and all bad. Food is a tool, and we just have to understand it. Like, for some people, the tools are better than others. Salt, like you're a yellow dot in salt. Now, we would die without salt. Not just because we need minerals, but because food preservation through millennia has been based on salt. So salt is super critical. Now, when people have variations in salt, which you do, you've got a yellow dot in salt, immediately people fly towards, oh, wait, that means I have high blood pressure. Not necessarily. What I see with, like, I have a red dot in salt and I don't have high blood pressure. But what can happen with people, and these things are potentials. They're not 100% guarantees to manifest, but you have a much higher potential to express the variation with salts. What I see with variation with salts is two things that can happen. One is the high blood pressure, but what I see usually is water retention. That's what I see. It's the people with the variations in salt, and like I just did a master class a couple weeks ago on the 16 genetic causes of stubborn weight gain. And I talked about water retention having multiple genetic influences, like salt. So if someone has, and this happened, my former intern has given me permission to talk about this. She was, in her late 20s. She was an athlete. She had her master's degree in functional medicine. She was my intern for 2 years. Like, she, perfect diet, but she still had this like belly weight, water weight around her belly, and her fingers were swollen. And she was super frustrated because she's quietly also super competitive in her own way. And then when she ran her genetics and she realized, like, oh, I have variations in salt and histamine. So she just changed her diet to drop the salt content and remove the histamine-based foods. And the swelling in her fingers and belly went away. It wasn't a lack of exercise that was the problem. It was a genetic vulnerability to water retention through very specific mechanisms. So for her, are you checking your fingers to see if you're swollen?
Yeah, I'm checking my fingers for swelling. Certainly have a little bit of belly that I would like to get rid of, but I'm not sure my fingers are swollen.
Hey, super quick break from the podcast. Hopefully you're loving it. This is a way you can support the podcast and take advantage of a great offer. We're offering 50% off of one of our MCT bottles. MCT is an amazing oil. Add the ESS60 molecule to it. It's even more amazing. All you got to do is leave a review on iTunes, send us a notification that you've left that review. We'll get you a coupon code that'll get you 50% off of our MCT oil and free shipping. Back to the podcast.
You must have dainty finger. I don't know. There you go. So that's what I see with salts variations. Then you have the histamine variation. Now, histamines are. I'm going to talk about histamines in much more detail because this one's complicated for people. It's also probably the most challenging dietary shift for people. So for people to understand what histamine is that don't understand, the simplest way to understand histamine is that it is the body's evolutionary defense mechanism to venom. The defense mechanism to venom. What I mean is that if you are bit by a spider or stung by a scorpion or stung by a bee or bit by a mosquito, or there's certain plants that will trigger this, or a centipede or whatever, when you get a scorpion that stings you, that is an injection of highly toxic venom into your system that you need to dilute immediately, or it's going to corrode and erode muscle, artery, vein, and if it's bad enough from certain snakes, it'll erode bone. Like, it's bad. So the histamine is the emergency flood switch to flood the area with water to do what? Dilute the toxic venom so it doesn't corrode or erode your precious tissues. So this, when a bee stings you, it doesn't inject a half quart of water. That's not a thing. The bee stings you and your body floods the area with a half quart of water based on how sensitive your genes are to histamine. So the higher the sensitivity, the stronger the reaction to any type of venom or perceived venom intrusion into your body. So it's a trade-off. So if the higher sensitivity you are to histamine, the faster you're going to flood the area with water. Now, the problem is you could choke out the very arteries, veins, and nerves you're trying to protect. But if you don't have enough water, then the venom's going to corrode or erode those very same nerves and arteries and veins. So it's this dance. That's why you have variation across the lineage, because even if you are in a high venom environment, sometimes the snakes move out or whatever, and then if you're suddenly living in a low venom environment, and then trivial things trigger a massive histamine response, and the people with the red dot and histamines, they're at an evolutionary disadvantage, whereas the green dots are at an advantage. And so, but over time, you just keep creating these variations down the lineage, and on average, everyone's going to survive, because as the environment changes, there's someone who's better adapted. But then in the next generation, you get variation from that person who's better adapted. So now the way it relates to food is that there are foods that have high histamine that bring in histamine into the body. Things like avocado, and I know we just lost half of our Californian audience right now.
I love avocado. I have avocado a couple of times a day.
And that is unfortunately a high histamine food. And this is the level. Like, you thought coffee negotiation was bad. Just wait till you see the list on histamine. So,
guess what I put on my avocados?
Coffee? Salt. I don't know.
Salt.
Okay. So with people food can bring histamine directly into the body. Other foods increase the production of internally generated histamine, or what's called endogenous histamine. Your body makes histamine all on its own, but some foods help promote its production. And then there's a third thing that can happen is certain foods block the enzyme, technically called dihistamininase, blocks the enzyme from breaking down excess histamine in the body. So you have three different mechanisms to increase histamine in the body, and all three have to be attended to if you have the genetic variation to histamine, particularly when you've got histamine signs. So signs of histamine are things like runny nose. I'll just jump right to the slide so I can just list them off without. So headaches, itchy skin, runny nose, fatigue, hives, digestive issues, and water or puffy weight. So those are things that people can look for if they suspect they may be carrying a high histamine load. And then I have this chart here on this page that talks about what are high histamine containing foods. And here's just a couple: alcohol, avocado, chocolate, long stored nuts, mature cheeses, pickled canned fruits, rice vinegar, fast, red salami meat, salty snacks, shellfish, smoked meats, preserved foods. Then there's foods that increase histamine already in the body. So that's additives, bananas, chocolate, citrus fruits, kiwi, legumes, mushroom, papaya, peanut, pineapple, plums, tomatoes, vinegar, walnuts, and wheat germ. And foods that block histamine removal are alcohol, black tea, coffee, caffeine, energy drinks, and green tea. So you can see, like, green tea is good for certain things, but if you have problems with histamine, it's not so good. You've got things like citrus fruits. Those are great for increasing your capacity for digestion, particularly carbs. But if you're sensitive to histamine, that may be a problem. Tomatoes. Tomatoes can be tomatoes are great for increasing your ability to break down carbs. Think tomato sauce and pasta, which we'll cover that one next, like about carb tolerance. But tomatoes can be problematic for histamine, but also they can be pro-inflammatory if you've got arthritides or rheumatoid arthritis or pain in your joints. So tomatoes can be good in one circle but bad in another. Citrus can be good in one circle and bad in another. That's why this overlapping Venn diagram is, to me, the most accurate representation of the complexity of diet. So then the next thing we're looking at with you is your yellow dot and food.
All right. Well, hold on. I got a couple questions, right? So tomatoes, my understanding is classically are prepared without the skins and without the seeds. I have to assume that is where most of the histamine-inducing components are. And
so that actually has to do more with you see this in Ayurveda, where they call the seeds and the skins indigestible because you see it in the poop. And so it may be from a standpoint of you cannot digest those. So therefore the assumption is it's causing problems. In that to what extent that's true or not, and can those just be viewed as fiber to help with bulk? I'm not sure. The other issues around skins may be to do more with, if you grow tomatoes with lots of sprays, then there's some level of protection by removing the skins from the tomatoes before cooking them. The other thing may just be a cooking preference simply from texture. If you get rid of the seeds and the skins, you have a lot more malleability to the texture of what you do with tomatoes. So I'm answering and also not answering your question because I don't actually know the nutrient profile differences between the seeds and skin relative to the flesh.
And then if we go to avocados, right? Let's go back to coffee. I've heard that L-theanine can back down. Got to negotiate the coffee. That's we got to keep.
I was waiting. I was actually set a timer here.
I think it's L-theanine can reduce coffee jitters, actually improve kind of response to coffee. Any ideas there? And maybe it's not.
So again, that goes to some complexities around other gene clusters. So if you have a red dot in your COMT gene, L-theanine will backfire.
Okay.
So L-theanine is not a good idea for people that have a variation in their COMT gene, because the COMT gene is responsible for breaking down, hormones and stress hormones and so on in the brain. And if you have a variation, the enzyme is slower, so you can't break them down. And L-theanine actually slows the enzyme down further. So again, it's that Venn diagram thing that you may be able to break down caffeine better, but you're not going to be able to break down adrenaline and cortisol in your brain better. So you're trading off one excitatory pathway for another. So I hope that wasn't too overly complex, kind of an interplay with genes, but this gets complicated real quick. Here's another way to think about it. There's a concept I don't know if I come up with, I haven't anyone else heard it. Someone else may have said it, but it came out of my little brain. But I call it bell curve biochemistry. So bell curve biochemistry is the phenomenon. Well, according to the study, L-theanine helps with this, but what the studies don't account for is genetic variations. And even if we got a big enough sample, yes, you have a sample in which you made a bell curve, and then you're making an assumption based on the middle of the bell curve. So that's the issue. This is bell curve biochemistry. This is bell curve statistics. And we're extrapolating to the masses based on a singular bell curve, which is great. If there's thousands of people, so that's wonderful. That's great. But it's still a freaking bell curve. And the thing about genetics is that we're actually parsing out people's individual bell curves. And that's how you can get genetics to be so specific to the individuals, because we're now looking at 100 separate bell curves as opposed to one.
Very, very cool. On a scale of the things to really be concerned about, how where would you put histamine?
Okay, so that also depends on where people are at with their lived experience. Headaches, itchy skin, runny nose, fatigue, hives, digestive issues, and puffy weight. So if someone has genetic variations in histamine and they've got a cluster of these issues that are known to be associated with active histamine intolerance, then we bump that up on the scale. Now, if someone, for example, is having is having a massive wheat-based diet and they're having stomach issues and they have a red and yellow dot in gluten, then that is very clearly the first place they have to go and have to go now. So it has. This is kind of the it's not a choose your own adventure. It's really about being honest with oneself. Where are my genetic vulnerabilities? But really, where are my vulnerabilities already active? And that's where I start.
Yep. Interesting. Okay. Very cool.
So the food allergies.
By the way, I
Any
also
other questions?
noticed in the middle Mediterranean.
We're going to cover that next. That's
Okay.
after the food allergies. Yeah.
Got it.
So the food actually it'll come after the diet behavior. Then we'll go to the carb tolerance. So the food allergies. You're a yellow dot here, and so what that means is that this is not necessarily to a specific food allergy. This means your reactivity to food allergens in general. So some people with a green dot, they're just not very reactive. Yellow dot slopes like this, red dot slopes up real sharp like that. So this means that if you are reactive to foods, you're going to be much more reactive to foods than the average person. And in general, it's good to start with an elimination diet. So I see this all the time, combo histamine and food allergens. So I put people on an antihistamine elimination diet, and I've compiled and cross-referenced multiple different versions of these diets into one singular document. It's a document you and anyone who gets genetic tests have. And I have like the good list and the bad list of what are the foods that are both low in histamine and low food allergen, and then what are the foods that are complicated with histamine and food allergens. And so the way that I thread the needle, and this is going to be useful for anyone listening, the way that I thread the needle for people who are struggling with, oh my God, but I can't live without avocado, or I can't live without coffee, or whatever high histamine vice you've got. What I say is the following. You go through the bad list, the column first time, and you already cross off all the things you don't already eat. So you already feel victorious in that way. So you're not eating these bad things in it. Great. Then you go through another time and you find the things that you rarely eat or could easily live without any effort. So there's no willpower involved. You cross off another chunk. You get another massive dopamine win. Then the next pass, you go through and you find your top 10. So avocados in my top 10. Ground meat, which can have histamines because the more you expose meat to air, the more leftovers under 3 days. Those are high histamine. You pick your top 10 things, and then you pick and prioritize those top 10, and you still eat those top 10, and you just cut out the rest that wasn't in the top 10. So that's the middle ground I have been able to successfully negotiate with all these frothing Californians who are just addicted to avocados. Because dosage matters. This is the punchline. Dosage matters. If you cut half of your histamine inducing foods out, that helps a lot. It helps a lot. I do this. I have like 6 things on my I have histamine issues. I have 6 things on my histamine list. It's ground meat, it's leftovers under 3 days.
When you say leftovers under 3 days, does that mean if you wait till the 4th day, then you don't have the histamine?
You generally don't want to have food that's older than 3 days, even in the fridge. Like in general, like it's just the whole point of in Ayurveda, they talk about it getting more rajasic. The older the food is, the like bat and like fire. It's like, and in my Western physiology, mine is like that's histamine, because the older something gets, the more histamines develop. So the longer it stays, the more histamines develop. So I just have this arbitrary number of 3 days. So I have like 6 foods that are high histamine in my world. And that's it. I don't even get to 10. And the dosage matters. And so I have quality of life, minimizing the amount of histamine. That's how I thread that needle. Now, if people have super reactions to histamine, then one, there may be some other underlying metabolic deficiencies that you're not able to create the dihistaminase enzymes, and you've got an underlying functional issue we need to identify and work with those. Or if you're just super sensitive to histamine, you may have to not have a top 10, but have a top 5 or a top 3 or whatever. Like, so this is the way I have basically boiled down the negotiation to 5 minutes. Here's the list, go through it these 3 times, and we're done. And people are like, okay, I can do that. And then once they go through it, they're fine.
Yeah.
They're fine. 10 is a lot. 10 is a lot. So I think it is totally winnable. So these are the food triggers. Now you almost have a full house except for the lactose. So lucky you win. The red dot and satiety means you're genetically vulnerable to overeating.
Mm-hmm. I can see that.
So this is diet and behavior. So this is because fullness is not in the stomach; it's in the brain.
Yep.
Fullness is up here, and the signal is delayed in your case. So what do we do if you have a red dot in satiety? That doesn't mean you careen into culinary nihilistic fatalism. You're like, oh, I got the red dot. I'll just eat everything in sight. No, I'm sorry, I can't stop. It's genetic. Like that. That's not a thing. We don't do that. So what you do is that you don't fight your willpower. You just change your environment. That's the difference. You change your environment, not your willpower. So, for example, I have this issue. I don't keep bread in the house. I am not stronger than bread, but I'm smarter than bread. I just don't have it in the house, and I win. I make it so I cannot fail in my house. Now, for some people, this may be a challenge, particularly if you've got a family and you got people with different ideas around diet, and there can be some real antagonism there. One, I recommend everyone get their genetics tested, so everyone is coming from a neutral third party. Like, this is the diet these are the diets we're all navigating here, and let's try to work with this out as a family, and let's support each other, because some people need more environmental support than others. Let's work together as a family. That is one way, I'd argue the best way to handle this issue. And for people, again, who are naysayers about any type of natural health, just say like, so you don't believe in genetics testing? And that usually ends the argument right there, because you can't argue with your genes. So you can enroll people to have the whole family get on board. Okay, the other thing you got is bitter taste. So this means you're a super taster for bitter, which means that you're more sensitive to bitter foods. Now, the bitter is one of those things where it's either red or green. And because it's either you're a super taster or you don't really taste bitter, or you really, really don't taste bitter. And that's kind of more in the red area for both of the non-tasters. So what that means is that for people who are hypersensitive to bitter, they're at risk of not eating as many healthy bitter vegetables, up to 100 to 200 pounds a year fewer.
Wow.
That's very significant. So there are ways to, if you are a green dot where you're a super taster for bitter, you're really sensitive to, I found 4 separate cooking methods, which is in the report of what those 4 are, to make foods less bitter. So you're more willing to eat the healthier based vegetables. And there's the same techniques that for people who love the taste of bitter, but they're cooking food for people who hate the taste of bitter. You use those same 4 techniques so you don't scare off your guests from the dinner party. So that's a significance of bitter flavor. Then sweet taste, your yellow dot, which means that you have a genetic vulnerability to craving sugar, the taste of it. So if you crave the taste of it, that means you're more likely to seek it out. And this is the same thing of change your environment, not your willpower. Just don't have the junk sweet foods around. One trick I'd recommend for people is there's an amino acid called glycine, which looks and tastes exactly like sugar. And it's an amino acid, and it's an important one. It's one of the 3 amino acids to make glutathione. It's one of the main amino acids for making bile. It's a huge structural amino acid. It is so important, glycine, and it looks and tastes exactly like sugar, and it's an amino acid, a healthy one. So that's one way to mitigate sweet taste, but I would say it's control your environment, not your willpower. Then there's sugar.
In my case, because I definitely have a sweet tooth. I've always had a sweet tooth. My favorite cake is cheap grocery store cake because of the icing, which is all sugar. Like, I don't even need a fancy cake. Just give me, and then I'm the one I want.
Give me icing or give me death. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah. Like, screw the cake. But what the way I've managed it is I now have like 1 square of dark chocolate and 1 square of milk chocolate, and that's the end of my day, right? So
well, you're literally talking about the next gene. So you're talking about the next gene you've got. So you're a green dot in sugar consumption, which means you don't need a lot of volume of sugar to feel satisfied. The yellow and red dots in sugar consumption, which I would prefer to rename sugar volume, These
okay, yeah.
people like this is the difference between someone's like, I just need 1-2 little squares of chocolate and I'm done. I hate these people because I have to have like 4 or 2. I hate these people. Present company accepted, of course. So then, so that's what we might eat by the sugar consumption dot. There's craving the flavor, then there's the actual volume. Then we have your red dot and fat taste, because fat is not just a calorie source; it's a flavor and a texture. So, like craving the texture and flavor of fat is very strong with you genetically. And so that means now I have a whole slide on what the good fats are and what the bad fats are. So having more fat is not necessarily a bad thing. Bad fat is a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it's just something to be aware of. And particularly with the next one is the response to fat intake, is that you're genetically a bit slower on processing saturated fats. I'm not saying avoid them. I'm saying you're just a bit slower. So for you, the ratio of saturated fat to unsaturated fat should be more biased on the unsaturated fat based on this cluster of genes there.
And examples of unsaturated fat. I'm
olive oil, olive oil, avocado oil, sesame oil. I mean, I'll just skip right to the. Here's a slide. This is literally 20 years of my life on fats right there. Olive oil, macadamia nut, avocado. Lard is technically a monounsaturated. Most people don't know that.
Interesting.
And then the polyunsaturated are sesame oil, grapeseed. Now, what's interesting is sesame oil and grapeseed oil have a bit of extra protective nutrients inside it to protect it from heat. But there's certain polyunsaturated oils you never heat, like fish oil, flax oil, and hemp seed oil. And then there's the ones in red here, like that are bad trans fats, like margarine, COFA, vegetable spreads, packaged foods, and avoid the following oils: soy, corn, canola, peanut, safflower, cottonseed, walnut, simply because it's so easily rancid, it becomes rancid so easily. And other quote-unquote vegetable oil, refined palm, rice bran, shortening, hydrogenated oils, and spread, deep fried oils, old oils, and reused oils. So that's what I mean by the unsaturated oils. Okay, so now we're coming to carb tolerance. So you're a 7, and so what that means is that you're right in the Mediterranean range, and so if you're a 7 out of 20, the way to understand it is that this is not looking at a green, yellow, and red. This is not looking at green, yellow, and red test. This is looking at not the variation of the gene, but the duplicates of the gene. So if you imagine a fort, and that's your digestive system, and you've got the Visigoths charging the gate, and the barbarians charging the gates, and you've got so many number of cannons on the gate to shoot down these carbs that are charging your fort. So the version of the cannon is the green, yellow, red dot. Now this is the one case where the AMY1 gene, this is the carb tolerance gene, the difference between red, yellow, and green is trivial. That let's just say it's 100 bullets per hour for green, 95 for yellow, and 90 for red. I would much rather have 7 cannons shooting 90 than 1 cannon shooting 100. That's the difference. So the number matters way more than the version of the cannon. So that's why we're counting the duplicates of this gene, not the version. So I'm a 2, you're a 7, which means literally you can have 3.5 times as many carbs as I can. So now the reason why I show a picture of fingers, those are a picture of my fingers there, 7 fingers, is that I had to figure.
I love your explanation of how you came up with this. So cover what it is, and then also briefly talk about.
Absolutely, I was literally about to go there. We watching Game of Thrones? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for people who are new to me, you're about to get an insight to how my brain. Okay, so I'm sitting watching Game of Thrones, and I think it was like season 5, and I'm sitting there thinking about genetics, like how in the world can I individualize someone's carb number to their size? Because if I'm looking at Peter Dinklage, who plays Tyrion, he's a dwarf. And then I look at someone like the Mountain. Which, by the way, his name is like Bjorn. It has to be Bjorn. I mean, the guy's a Viking through and through. Let's just say it's Bjorn, whatever, or Thor. It was probably Bjorn.
At some
probably
point, it was Bjorn. Anyway,
I think people just move out of the way. Like there's a Bjorn warning signal when they hear feel the earth shaking when he's walking by. So and Bjorn is literally the strongest man in the world. He lifted 501 kgs. That's over 1,000 pounds. That's a small car.
Half a ton.
Now, what's funny is Peter and Bjorn are friends in real life, and they go out to dinner. Peter talked about this on one of the late shows. And he just watched Bjorn eat 7 chickens for dinner. And it's like, no, he didn't bite off the head and then like just the whole, he was like 7 separate chickens. So I'm thinking to myself, if they were, either of them were a 7, that would make no sense to say, well, you're a 7, so that means it's 700 calories out of your 2,000 calorie diet because you're a 7. Now, that would be way too much for Peter, and that would barely fit between Bjorn's teeth.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So it made no sense to me. How can I say in good conscience, you're a 7, this is this many calories? It's nonsense. But what I realized is that, wait a minute, Peter is a dwarf. I used to teach X-ray analysis to chiropractors, and we use dwarf anatomy to teach X-ray anatomy because there's so many differences between dwarf skeletons and non-dwarf skeletons. Particularly the fingers of dwarves are shaped differently with their bony structure. It's like, wait a minute. What scales roughly with height and weight? Finger size. So Peter's longest finger is likely 3/4 the length of my pinky, while Bjorn's longest finger is probably 3/4 the length of my forearm.
Yeah.
So I now had a system that was literally at hand to individualize people's volume of carbs on their plate. And that's the finger rule. So you're 7, it's 7 fingers maximum per meal of high carb foods. Now, it's not mandatory, it's a maximum, it's an upper limit. So high carbs are grains and corn, tubers like potatoes, and sweet fruits like gala apples. Whereas low carb foods, I say it can be up to a 2x of that. So grains and corn are 1x, in your case 7, whereas nuts and beans would be 2x because nuts and beans are like carbs plus protein and fat, especially in the case of nuts. Potatoes are much higher concentrated in carbs than, say, squash. Gala apple, way more sweet than a Granny Smith apple. So what I've come up with is the finger rule with an upper limit of 10. So if your whole, this is 5 fingers with the thumb, and if you take this, your other hand, and you put the base of your palm against the knuckle line of your hand, you'll see that it's 5 fingers, including the thumb, fits perfectly over the palm. You see that? It's like there's 5 fingers, and then this is 5 fingers. So the whole fist is 10 fingers. Actually, a little bit more because the thickness of the palm is thicker than the thickness of the fingers. But do you really want to eat more than a fistful of carbs? Like, because your stomach is roughly the size of your fist. Yes, your stomach does stretch. So basically, if you have a higher carb number, you don't really want to go beyond a fistful of carbs anyway, unless there's extenuating circumstances like you're running a marathon or you're in a very high athletic competitive environment and you need more carbs. So in your case, you're a 7, which means that 7 fingers of higher carb foods maximum per meal, or 2x, or really just a fist worth of the other ones maximum per meal. So any questions on that?
Where do sweet potatoes fit in?
They're kind of straddling. They're like 1.5. Okay. I should really put a note in on that because you're not the first person to ask that. They've got more fiber than potato, but I think they've got a bit higher concentration of carbs than, say, a carrot.
Would you say resistant versus non-resistant starts splitting this, or is it unrelated?
I would put resistant starch in different categories. So here's a great question. So there's 4 types of starches. There's no starch, which I say no carbs. This is fiber, like salad greens. Mm-hmm. There's no calories in that thing. Low starch or low carbs. So these are things like nuts and almonds. And then there's high starch, which are high carbs. These are calorie dense. These are calories for you, like potatoes, grains, corn, sweet fruits, processed granola bars, etc. Then there's resistant starch. So resistant starch are calories not for you, but for your gut flora.
Mm-hmm.
They're calories for your gut flora. So think of like green bananas, not ripe, green bananas or chickpeas. So I don't really count resistant starch as part of your carb number. I mean, I should probably, like, maybe it's like a 1/4 or something. You know what I really should do is I should go look up the ratio of resistant starch to high starch in green bananas versus ripe bananas, and then I'll get some sort of ratio that I could think of. So it's like, and same thing with chickpeas. But you raise a great point. I should go figure that out.
Well, and it's interesting because, I've been using a technique. What I do is each day I eat about a sweet potato, maybe 3/4 of a sweet potato, but I actually cook it today, and then refrigerate it and then eat it the next day. Because my understanding is with these starches, you actually can turn them more into resistant starches by letting them cool.
Look, I know what you're talking about, and that's where Chris Kresser was the one who talked about the potato diet. And that's where he popularized this, where you cook cold potatoes and then you cool them, then you reheat them, then you cook them, then you cool them, you reheat, and each time you make them more and more resistant starch. I would caution people on that with the following reason. Get a continuous glucose monitor before you do this.
I definitely need to do that.
Okay, because I tried to do this trick, and I'm a 2, which means I am very sensitive to carbs. And I don't care how cold and overcooked the rice was, my blood sugar spiked like mad. So I think it's not. I think that's bell curve biochemistry.
Yep.
I think it's bell curve biochemistry. I think there's total merit to it, 100% merit to it, but
it may not be true for you.
Not for me
Whoever
anyway.
you are.
Have a source of truth, which to me was the glucose monitor.
Well, and there's another one where they apparently adding MCT oil to rice or cooking rice with MCT oil. But I actually saw a guy with a glucose monitor. So this is,
I cook with tons of coconut oil in my rice, and it was cold, and it's still
like everything. You're like,
biochemistry.
I just want one more finger of carbs, please.
It's like just begging for the carbs here. So, and there are ways to temper.
I believe you earlier called that negotiation.
Yes, failed negotiation, I think is what I should have said. So there are ways to temporarily increase your carb capacity, particularly if it's a social event, it's a birthday, you're traveling, or whatever. So chewing will increase the enzymatic mixture of amylase into your foods. Having greens first, like the Europeans, will trigger amylase more. Acid will help. Now I'm talking about lemon, lime, and apple cider vinegar strictly from a carb tolerance standpoint, not the histamine angle. So people may have histamine issues with lemons, limes, and apple cider vinegar, but they may do really well with it for carbs. Same thing with citric acid. Like, tomatoes are great for the citric acid to break down carbs, but they're not a good idea for people who are having problems with nightshades. And like grapefruit is great for citric acid, but for certain people on certain medications like blood thinning or hypertensive medications, grapefruit is a big no-no. So this is just looking at it strictly through the increasing carb tolerance lens. Now here's an interesting one. Exercising, you have a 2-hour window approximately where your enzymes for breaking down carbs can jump by up to 500%. So if you're going to eat your highest carb meal, do the meal directly after you exercise. That will be the time you have the most enzymatic support to break down carbs. The next section of the report is just going through individually each trigger food with each slide and like specific to your specific dot with a lot more detail. I gave the big picture, going through that Venn diagram. And then as you can see, like there's lots of actionable information based on each gene, and there's way, way more in the online portal, but this is me condensing it down to what's practical. Then we've got some other things to cover, like your vitamin D absorption. You've actually got a pretty poor profile when it comes to vitamin D, and that not only synthesizing it, but absorbing it. And so for absorbing vitamin vitamin D, it's not simply taking more vitamin D. It's actually avoiding pollution and smoking, and also taking things like sulforaphane, which is a specialized broccoli sprout extract. That's very, very important to you for to utilize vitamin D. Then
Now, sulforaphane, my understanding, great from broccoli sprouts, right? But is fairly unstable, isn't it? Or what's the best way to get that in his diet?
So not all broccoli. So there's over 300. I learned this directly from Dr. Houghton, who's done 30 years of research on sulforaphane, and she's the one who talks about how there's 300 different varieties, approximately, of broccoli. Not all broccoli seeds from every broccoli strain have the correct ratios of the enzyme and substrate that combine together to form sulforaphane. For the nerds out there, or at least the Scrabble enthusiasts, the enzyme is called miracinase, and the substrate is called glucoraphanin. And you've got to combine, chewing them will combine together to release sulforaphane. And what's actually, I believe it was a pesticide that when an insect bites into broccoli, then the miracinase and the glucoraphanin will combine to form the sulforaphane to kill the insect. It's very similar to allicin in garlic, when where the insect will bite the garlic, and then the thing that combines from the crushed garlic remains will then kill the thing that bit it. So I think it was a natural pesticide. And so what happens is that it's hard to know what sulforaphane capacity you have from any broccoli seed. Now, there's plenty of benefits to broccoli seeds. Sulforaphane is just one of them, and it's not clear how much you're going to get. So what I say is that to look to practitioner-level companies that actually have the correct ratios of miracinase to glucoraphanin in the capsule. Now, to say that someone has actual sulforaphane liquid and you can take it, I'm skeptical, because I don't know how well you can stabilize that. But what you can do is take the enzyme and substrate together, then it combines in your stomach, and then suddenly, whoop, oh, you got your sulforaphane. So that's what I would recommend, is to get sulforaphane through a trusted practitioner-level company that us practitioners use.
Okay, and that's, I think one of the reports was like supplemental.
Yeah, I go through a list. I have an entire addendum of like what supplements are recommended in what amounts from what company and so on, and what's the loading dose and what's the maintenance levels you got it. There's an amount to wake up the genes, and then there's an amount to maintain the open genes.
Excellent. Okay.
So zinc, you have some poor zinc metabolism, so you may need higher zinc consumption overall. Now, I'm not averse at all to someone getting zinc copper testing on a regular basis, because these are propensities, not guarantees. So if you've been people can have a red dot in zinc and have very high zinc if they've been eating a lot of foods in zinc. So it's something to test. Now, here we have shellfish high in zinc, but shellfish is really high in histamine. So this is just through a zinc lens right here. Vitamin C, yellow dots, so same thing, needs some more support with vitamin C. Now here we get to the inflammatory profile. You have one of the strongest pro-inflammatory profiles I've seen. You have 14 out of the 15 major inflammatory genes have variations on them. So you're very, very pro-inflammatory, which is very significant. And I have 13 out of 15. Of these dots is really.
I win.
You win, because you win the inflammatory Olympics. So what this means is that's how important your anti-inflammatory diet and lifestyle nutrients are, which we're going to cover just in a tiny bit. Your ability to clean up free radicals in your mitochondria is a yellow dot. Your liver detox capacity. This is a much longer discussion on understanding the liver detox system as a washer-dryer system. Your ability to deal with toxins effectively is a yellow dot. The estrogen, I think you had one gene, occasionally one gene does, and this was the GST gene, one gene occasionally fails out of the 150 or so. So that's why there's a question mark there on that one. And fortunately, you have an HO1, which this is an inflammatory gene of the liver. That's a green dot. So that helps minimize some of the inflammatory windup. This is a resource on where estrogen imbalances come from, exogenous estrogen. So a lot of people, they realize they may struggle with detoxing estrogens. So they've got, I put a list here of like heated plastics, soy products, hormones and antibiotics found in meats, pesticides, insecticides. Alcohol has a lot of estrogens in them. Unfiltered city water from birth control pill residues, makeups, internal visceral fat also has estrogens it creates. And then you've got for methylation, this is not just MTHFR. Now, some people ask, well, what are the specific genes? That's in the official genetics report. If you want to look up all the specific genes you have and their individual things, that is in, that's in the, official report here. Like here's,
Oh, yeah.
like this is the official report, and you can see right there. So you can look up all the individual genes, but methylation, you have 7 out of 12 of the major methylation genes are variations. And the good news about this particular genetic test, from the inflammation down, is that we don't have to freak out about methylation necessarily, because inflammation controls methylation. So these particular genes are in a rank order. So inflammation is above free radical scavenging in the mitochondria, which is above liver detox, which is above the vitamin D receptors, which is above methylation, which is above the cardiovascular system, which is above fat and energy metabolism. So if you work on the genes above, it'll help the genes below. The MAOA or genes that are associated with moods. No, these genes, there is no green dot is better in the MAOA one. It's just different. It's just different issues. So this is one example of the MAOA where green is not, quote, good and red is, quote, bad. It's just, they're different. And in your case, exercise and stress management are the things that help with both. Now, there are other things that help with MAOA1, but also make MAOA2 worse. So the only things that crossed over from the research that I saw that help both reliably is exercise and stress management, which again, to some people is like, well, isn't that obvious? Like, yeah, but some people need the reminder.
Yep.
And then finishing up here, we've got your blood pressure. So you have a yellow dot in blood pressure, which means that you have a higher risk of blood pressure. Doesn't mean you have it. But your vessel integrity is a green dot. That means overall the integrity and strength of your circulatory system is strong, as opposed to having very vulnerable to cracks and leaks and so on. Then we've got appetite control, big honking red dot there. And your ability to burn fat for energy and fat for heat is also limited in yellow dots. So that means that you're at a risk for maybe running colder than other people, and difficulty burning fat for just burning your fat in general, whether it's for heat or energy. So then finally, we're in the very home stretch here. We've got out of the 67 dots, you have 22 green, 38 yellow, and 7 red, which what I found is that for people who have under 20 green dots like me, I think I have like 16 or 17, we really struggle with chronic health issues. Between 20 and 30 is like average. People above 30, unless they're really sabotaging their life, they have a pretty cruisy health future to them. I've actually not really seen that few red dots in almost anyone. 7, that's impressive. I've not seen that few number of red dots. So awesome. Then we have a summary page here of like, it's just a different readout from, say, that Venn diagram. This is kind of in grid format of what the issue is, and then is it red, yellow, or green? And then we come to your master lifestyle grid chart. And so I will zoom in a bit on this. And so what you're seeing here is, how do you know what to do first in order to improve your lifestyle the fastest? So of the first 40 genes of that health and wellness panel, or the what's also called the Achieve Your Natural Way panel, the first 40 are the most important. The 15 inflammatory genes, the 3 free radical scavenging genes, the 8 liver detox genes, the 2 vitamin D receptor genes, and then the 12 methylation genes. Of those 40, 27 are red and yellow dots. And as you know, 14 of them are in fact, and all 14 of the ones represented here are the inflammatory genes. So what we're looking for is what are the fewest number of interventions that benefit the most number of the highest value genes. So by benefit, this is epigenetics. This is my genes won't change, but the expression will change, meaning that my red and yellow dot inflammatory genes will now behave more green-like. They'll never become green, but they will behave more green-like. So in your case, 14 out of the 27 genes, or over half of the most important genes, are helped just by taking higher amounts of omega-3 fish oils. Over half. Now, this is what happened to me. My joint pain went away, in part due to taking much higher levels of fish oil, because the 1 gram a day wasn't cutting it because it wasn't changing the genetic expression. Nutrigenomic supplement levels are when the supplement level is high enough to change the expression of the genes. So you're not just throwing widgets into the machinery, you're changing the machinery. So the research shows is a minimum 2 grams of fish oil, EPA, DHA combined starts to have the epigenetic effect. So going on higher levels consistently for the first 4 months or so can change the whole inflammatory machinery of your cells. The next one down is avoiding smoking, both passive and active, or air pollution, helps 14 of those 27. Sulforaphane helps over half, 14 out of, and then we can just go down the list here. Increasing fiber intake, omega-3 rich foods, decreasing omega-6 foods, superoxide dismutase inducers. That's a mouthful for people, but there's a specific class of nutrients that induce that free radical scavenging enzyme in the mitochondria. Those help 13, even though it's only one of those genes is the MN-SOD gene we talked about, it helps 12 others as well. Vitamin D by itself helps 13 of the genes. Overtraining, you're at risk of overtraining, Chris. If you over-exercise...
Talk about overtraining, and then I don't know if we want to schedule to come back and visit. We're well into this. I've got some time. I just want to be mindful of yours.
Yeah, I do have to run, so we can schedule a follow up to this. That's no problem, and we can cover some of the lifestyle addendum. We can go into. Here's what I'd recommend. Go through your own reports and start to generate all your own questions, and we'll just do it like a Q&A and like go into the weeds a bit more. So the big picture here, I just want to point out, the big picture for you is that you know where to start with your lifestyle because it's rank ordered. By the way, these numbers, the reason you got these numbers, because each one of these numbers represents a paper associated with the gene and the lifestyle recommendation that shows that the lifestyle recommendation alone changes the genetic expression of the gene from behaving more green dot. So 14 of these genes have a minimum 14 papers, minimum 1 per gene. That's what the numbers are coming from. So I can say with full confidence that you start at the top and you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And you can see the diminishing turns all the way down to like 5s, because I know that this thing has research behind it, done on humans, by the way, not wombats or nematodes. These papers are done on humans, the research, to show that the expression will change. Then we can show you, this is the supplement. This is the supplement recommendations, rank ordered. I'm not saying you have to take all 14 of these things. They're rank ordered. Some people only want to take 1 thing, or they only want to take 3 things, or 5 things, or 7 things, or whatever it is. It's based on the supplements here are based on a combination of this chart and also how intense are the red and yellows of other things in your report, like where is histamine on this? Where is zinc metabolism? Where is vitamin C? So things are rank ordered, like zinc is up here, and it's well above vitamin C because zinc is a red dot compared to vitamin C's yellow. There's a whole algorithm that was put together to rank order these things. So people who have limited finances or limited capacity to handle supplements or pills, don't worry. You just pick the one at the top and you just work your way down to whatever you're comfortable with. And that's how this is totally practical and winnable. So that's the overview report.
Wow, this is everything that I thought it was going to be, and then there's going to be more. I did have one thing, just for clarity. I'm a 7 with carbs. That's per meal, or is that per day?
But maximum per meal, not mandatory per meal.
Okay. And then that's typically, I'm assuming, you're classically working off of the 3 meals a day, right? Like doesn't take intermittent fasting into account. Yeah.
So if you're doing with intermittent fasting, then you can condense a bit. And if you're exercising, particularly right before you're eating, then that's definitely the best time to do your higher carbs.
to get those carbs.
Yeah.
Dr. Shay, this has been awesome. Really dug in deep. I don't know if there's anything you want to wrap up with. Otherwise, we'll just sign off.
I think the thing that I would wrap up with is the following: that the genetic test is the single most cost-effective and efficient test one can ever do in one's entire life, without even a close second. And as you can see, we've covered diet in a lot of nuance, and we've covered lifestyle in a lot of nuance. And if you can dial in your genetics, then you've got a blueprint for life. And if you run into a plateau, that's your signal to know to investigate deeper with functional testing. It's not that the genes were wrong. It's that they were wrapped in barbed wire in one degree or another. So I would encourage people to get their genetics and know that the genetics is not just the short game, it's the long game. And I would have done anything to have my genetics test done when I was 16 as opposed to 36.
Yeah.
It would have saved me 20 years of absolute grief.
We've all done diets, right? And different diets have pointed us in the right direction, and we pick up some of the good stuff off of them. If you've just got this blueprint that is genetic and fixed, right? And it's if you continually reference it, it points you in the right direction. I think that's awesome. Well, Dr. Shay, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Chris. It was great to talk with you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow. Also, make sure not to be that guy, the guy sharing this podcast with people who are not interested in living beyond the norms. If you would like to learn more about the ESS60 molecule, the molecule responsible for the single longest longevity experimental result on mammals in history, a full 90% extension of life, visit myvitalc.com. That's myvitalc as in carbon.com.